Hi, everybody. My name is Ted, and welcome to EPE 301 Education in American Culture. Um, I wanted to start us off this semester with a video discussion of some of our first week's readings and hopefully help you guys synthesize a couple of the different points from the readings and have something that you can take into the discussion boards. Um, so I wanted to start off here by kind of sharing my central thesis for this week's readings, which is that education is not a value neutral endeavor. Um, that's because its structures, goals, and daily practices are often profoundly shaped by and in turn shape the larger social, political, and economic forces of society in which it is a part. Um, in this way, we can think of the American school as sort of both a mirror representing what our country values and an engine which is helping to produce the next generation of American society. That's kind of heavy. I think this topic we're starting off with is going to be a little bit heavy, but I'm going to do my best to sort of try to walk us through it, and we will be returning to some of these themes throughout the semester. So if you guys find this a little complicated to start off with, don't don't worry. So let's get into it. I want to start by asking everybody a question. So, who do you think decides what gets taught to students? Is it teachers? Is it parents? Is it the government? Well, I think the all those answers are probably correct in some form. And my argument also is that education is a socially embedded practice, which means it exists within society and as a part of society, which means that it's going to be shaped by external social needs, cultural values, like what we value as a society, our economic demands, and political conflicts, the culture wars, for example. There's cultural values too, but uh, so it functions to socialize individuals, transmit culture, and sort people into different social roles. So think about back in high school, maybe if you guys were in a public high school like me, there were different educational tracks or classes you might be able to get into, like a gen ed math, advanced math, or even an AP, calculus. Those kinds of different educational tracks all serve to sort of either um, separate students and kind of put them into different boxes. And that can help to either reproduce or challenge the existing social order. Well, education broadly does that. So today we're going to use these three key texts that I have for you all to show how the American school is a product of its social environment, focusing on its role as a nation builder, a site of conflict, and finally, a moral or ethical community builder. So, the first reading that we're going to talk about today is Graham's reading, which starts us off with a historical account of the ways in which our education system has responded to the different needs of society throughout the country's history. So, if you all recall your history, after the Revolutionary War, our country was still in a time of trying to find its own identity. And we were asking ourselves, what does it mean to be an American? So Graham's argument is that during that time, 18th century into the 19th century, We had large waves of early immigration, and American government was trying to figure out how do we make these people, or bring these people into what we conceive as the American project. How do we make these people American citizens? And I'm not talking about just like the piece of paperwork, but like the idea of being an American citizen. What does it mean to be an American? Um, as time went on, Graham gives us a second phase of American education, which is the sort of embracing of a school of psychology and a rejection of a sort of more formal one size fits all curriculum, along with an acceptance of interest based learning to help train students for different predefined adult roles or jobs. Try to help us fill certain needs, like we need more farmers, or we need more people in manufacturing, or we need more doctors or lawyers. The third phase that Graham talks about is in response to the civil rights movement. The American school played a pivotal role during that time in the struggle for racial equality. Advocates for and against desegregation fought over school policy at the local, state, and federal levels to achieve their vision of educational success and their vision for society. Finally, Graham points out the most recent educational need we've turned to the American school to try to fix, which is responding to American deindustrialization and global economic competition. Kind of starting in the early 1980s, these people argued that the school should be responsible for developing human capital, which is sort of an economic theory that economists use to judge the personal attributes that they think are useful in economic productivity. So, basically, what Graham has been trying to do in all of these different eras of American education is show that the purpose of school has sort of changed. It's not always static. The way that we conceive of education changes depending on the needs of our society. So next up, our reading that we're going to discuss is the Labaree reading. So we've already sort of touched on the American school's role as a site of conflict when I mentioned the civil rights movement and desegregation. But Labaree's reading can help us further understand this phenomenon. Labaree argues that the reason why the fight for control of our schools seems like a perpetual struggle is because different groups in society, different social groups, have different interests. And all of them want to use the schools to achieve different outcomes. So Labaree gives us three separate goals in his article. So the first one is democratic equality. This means that schools should be focusing on preparing citizens. This perspective is sort of representative of the interests of us as citizens, as well as the democratic sort of political state that cares about citizens voting and making informed choices when participating in government. Our second goal is social efficiency. And that means schools should focus on training and sorting workers for the different jobs that our economy needs. This view reflects us as the taxpayer, maybe an employer, as well as the state's interest in managing our economy. Finally, we have the social mobility goal, which says that schools should prepare individuals for competitive jobs and social positions in our stratified society, which has unequal distributions of resources, power, or prestige. And this view is representing our interests sometimes as individuals who are trying to get our own level of, highest level of achievement that we possibly can. Now, one thing you guys might have noticed or picked up on here is that it is possible for us to be potentially all three of these. When I said we have our interests as a citizen, interests as a taxpayer, and interests as an individual. Um, I do want to note that, you know, we can have multiple identities. So, another thing is that I think sometimes maybe social efficiency and social mobility can sound a little bit similar, but the emphasis of social efficiency as a goal is based on maintaining our whole economic system. So, like, maybe you don't want to be the person who is taking out the trash, but we know that for the sake of our system, somebody has to have that job. Social mobility is focused on you as an individual and potentially your role in the American economy. So, like, if you're trying to get the best job possible. Um, the key thing to understand really is that these goals are often in tension um, directly. So, like, they're directly fighting over, what's going to win out. Um, and the push for social mobility, which treats education as a private good, especially, can actively undermine the democratic goal of equality, building a common citizenry. And we're going to see that Durkheim is very concerned about that in our third reading. So, in this particular reading, I just want to reiterate the concepts of democratic equality, social efficiency, and social mobility are all going to provide us with useful tools for evaluating the history of American education and current policy debates. Because our schools aren't just shaped by society's expectations, they are a part of our society's ecosystem, which can hold contradictory viewpoints at the same time, such as the political equality versus economic inequality that social mobility sort of understands, and collective good idea of collective good versus individual ambition. There's sort of, these two dichotomies here. So we're going to move into the third reading now. This is by Emile Durkheim. It's just a small section out of one of his books. And I wanted to include this because he is sort of providing a sociological theory on what schools do within their practices. And he argues that they are primarily a means for socialization. Now, socialization is a process in which individuals learn about the norms of their society, learn about what's acceptable and what's not. Durkheim argues that the school is a crucial institution because it's part of what he calls the intermediate society, which functions sort of in between the family and the state. The family's got an emphasis sort of on, strong personal connections. It can also be personal relationships. And the state is just sort of like an abstract thing with impersonal rules. Durkheim argues basically that the function of the school is to teach us the habits of collective life, teach us about cooperation, discipline, and deferring to the common good over personal desire. And these are sort of like this is like the hidden curriculum, if you've ever heard of that, like the unwritten rules, like you sort of learn, you know, when people talk about like, oh, this person was homeschooled, there's always sort of a worry of like, did they learn this hidden curriculum? How were they socialized as a kid? Um, and that's sort of hinting at what the argument he's trying to make. Um, so these traits are really important for any functioning society, because, like I said, they help students and kids learn what's acceptable and what's not. For example, like stealing is wrong. Where are you going to hear that? You're going to learn that from your parents potentially, but if they didn't learn it from their parents, they're going to hear it from a teacher. Don't cheat. They're probably going to hear that from a teacher, and the list goes on. So our other readings, we can look at the other readings to help us understand how Durkheim's argument about socialization, especially like socialization from like a moral or an ethical standpoint, works. So, for example, the first phase of Graham's history of American schools, we talked about the founders of the United States really wanted to build an American identity. So right there we're talking about what does it mean to be an American? How can we find a way for us all to share this American identity? And Labaree's argument about democratic equality is also doing the same thing. It aligns with this idea that we all sort of need to be trying to function together as one community, one society, one country. So to wrap things up, let's just quickly review each of these readings to understand how they can help us understand American education as we start this semester. So Graham gives us, or he shows us, how schools can change with society as it prioritizes different goals. Labaree gives us a structural theory of why this happens, which is that schools are sites of conflict and different groups have competing interests, and sometimes in history a certain interest is going to sort of win out. Finally, Durkheim provides us with a functional core for this sort of process of socialization, and basically says, schools are teaching kids what they should value. So I think it's important for us to remember what it means for education to be a socially embedded practice. It reflects many of the ideological debates and desires that we have as a country. And to understand what happens inside schools, we need to also be thinking about what happens in society, because schools are part of society and we can see that reflected back in schools. So for the next 2 weeks, we're going to be looking at some of the intellectual history of Western education that led us towards the founding of the U.S. and its educational project. But keep these readings that we've started with this week in the back of your mind, as we start to enter in once again to the early American education and its history. So thank you guys very much for listening. If you got any questions, feel free to include them in the reading quiz if you haven't. And maybe I'll try to address some stuff in the video. Hopefully I'll try to be doing one of these once a week. So thank you guys, and I hope we have a great semester. Bye.